Thanks for checking us out online. We hope this message helps you encounter God's goodness and love for you. For more information, check us out online at happychurch.ca or follow us on social media at Celebration Church Brand.
Today I want to start by asking you the question, what do you want? Of all the things you could have right now, maybe you're wishing for, praying for, thinking about what's the one thing that tops the list? And if I were to get into your internet browser history, what would I learn about what you want? Like maybe it's full of a bunch of shopping sites, Amazon, eBay, Kijiji. Maybe it's full of travel sites, right? Travelocity, Trivago, Airbnb. Maybe it's dating sites. I don't know what those ones are. But I know there's 15,000 of them. So a lot of people are looking for those ones. Maybe it's a specific shop, like maybe it's all car sites. Maybe it's all motorcycle sites. What is it that you want? Why do you want it? What is it about that one thing that makes you want it above everything else? If I had to guess, and I think I'm probably right, we're all the same, is because we believe that one thing will make us happier. That it would make our life better, and our life would be better, and we would be happier. We'd answer that question one way. I want to ask you another question. Do you remember when you wanted what you have right now? Like before you had it, do you remember how you felt about that? It probably felt similar to how you feel about the thing you want right now. Right? And why did you want that? Probably because you thought that one thing would make you happier and would give you satisfaction in life. The question is, did it? Did it live up to the expectation? And did it give you a lasting happiness and a lasting satisfaction? I would bet it didn't. This is my phone. It's a Samsung Galaxy S8. It's a pretty good phone. When I got it, it was the best phone I could get. That was a year and a half ago, which means I'm still under contract. I'm still paying for it. And Samsung has released 2 new models of my phone, which means I don't want this one anymore. It promised so much. And yeah, I loved it for a little bit. But then my kids went out and got the newer versions. And now I want their versions. That's the way it works with want. There's this cycle to want. We want a thing. We get the thing. In our society, we normally get what we want. We get the thing, and then we want something else. The things we want, the things we think about, they promise so much, but they don't deliver. They leave us wanting more. We have this insatiable desire for more, for stuff. We have this cycle. What I want us to see today is that your satisfaction isn't found in your stuff. And you can define stuff however you want. It can be material goods. It could be a new car. It could be a new home. It could be a new friend. It could be a new relationship. It could be a fancy vacation. Whatever it is that when I say what do you want, that popped into your mind, that won't give you the satisfaction, not the long-term lasting satisfaction that you think it will right now. So if you were to go onto my internet browser and you would see that I bought a motorcycle last fall. I haven't ridden it yet. It's been in my garage all winter, and I want to ride this. I believe it will make my life happier. Guess what I've done all winter? I've shopped for more and more and more parts and accessories to make this thing I already love better and more satisfying. You would be able to answer that. Will that make Lance happier? Probably momentarily. But eventually that's going to fade. And it won't give me the happiness that I think deep down that it will give me. It will give me a measure of happiness, I'm sure. But it won't last. Because here's the thing. Temporal things can't give us eternal satisfaction. Things that don't last can't give you a satisfaction that lasts. Lasting satisfaction isn't found in temporal stuff. And so when we put the object of our desire as something that's going to wear out and break and fade away, our satisfaction, it won't give us a lasting satisfaction. Jesus understood that. He says this to us in Matthew chapter 6. He says, don't store up treasures here on earth. Don't put your value in things here on earth. Why? Because down here, moss eats them, rust destroys them, and thieves will break in and steal it. The thing you desire, it won't last, so don't make that the object of your desire. He continues, gives us an alternative. Store up your treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. What you want matters. That's what Jesus is saying. And he's saying that our satisfaction in life is dependent upon where we put our value and the things that we choose to want. Those things, the objects of our desire, determine how satisfied we'll be in this life. And temporal things can only lead to temporal satisfaction. If you want an eternal, long-lasting, deep-down satisfaction, your heart, your want has to be for something that's eternal and long-lasting. And so Jesus tells us we need to redirect our desires. You won't find a meaningful, satisfying life in the things we define as stuff. Why? Because toys break, people let us down, the trip ends. We have to shift where we put our desires. I like what Steve McVey says. He says this: our identity and our destiny don't find their roots in the finite, but in the infinite one. Our identity, our destiny, our satisfaction in life is not found in temporal things that pass away, but in the eternal one who made us. And it doesn't matter how much temporal stuff you accumulate, it won't equal the eternal one. That you and I were made for a relationship with a God who is infinite and eternal. And until we have that relationship, there will be a gaping hole that will never fill. Blaise Pascal, a mathematician, said, there's a God-shaped hole in all of us. And it's a hole that only God can fill. You can put as much stuff in there. You can fill as much motorcycles and cell phones and trips and people. But until you put God in that hole, you're going to have this insatiable want and feel like I have so much, but at the same time I have so little. You won't have a contentment until you get Jesus deep down into the core of who you are. And so the more you know God, the more of God you get to know, the more satisfied you'll find you are. God's the only one who can satisfy that insatiable desire for more, because God is eternal and infinite and will never exhaust his ability to just pour into our lives. Well, I'm going to introduce you to a guy named Abraham this morning. And actually, Abraham has two names, and I'm going to use them interchangeably because I can't keep it straight as we go on. So I'm just going to put it out here now. He was named Abram, and then God changed his name to Abraham. And he had a wife whose name was Sarai, and God changed her name to Sarah. And we're going to explain why they got new names later. But I'll probably bounce back and forth between the two. Just know that I'm not talking about two people. I am talking about two people, not four people. It's two people with two names each, okay? You can see how confusing it is. We're already getting into trouble. Anyway, Abraham was very, very successful. He was the envy of his neighborhood. He was powerful. He was wealthy. He had servants and slaves. He conquered other kings. He had more than what he knew what to do with. God just seemed to bless him and bless him and bless him. But there was one thing that Abraham didn't have. And it was the one thing that Abraham wanted. And that's kind of how it is with us. We can have all this stuff, but if there's this one thing that we want that we don't have, it feels like we have nothing. It feels like God has just held out so much good. He can bless us in so many areas of our life, but if there's one thing we want and we don't get it, we begin to question and wonder if God's good. If God is real, if God loves us, and if God knows what's going on in our life. So Abraham has all this stuff. He's got this massive wealth. He could pass it on to his son, but he doesn't have any sons. He says this to God in Genesis chapter 15. It says, but Abraham replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. Have you ever prayed a prayer like that? God, how come you're holding out on me? I mean, from everyone else's perspective, Abraham had it all. He was living the good life. But the one thing he wanted, a son, and we don't blame him for wanting that. The one thing he wanted that he didn't have began to shape his relationship with God. God, how come you're holding out on me? How come you don't answer Abraham had prayed for his son many, many, many times. For years and years and years, he had struggled with infertility. The one thing that he wanted more than anything else, he didn't have. And he begins to pray to God, how come, God? Why aren't you answering my prayer? Does it ever feel like God's not answering your prayer? This is what Abraham is is dealing with in this moment. So if you've ever been through that, you know what he's feeling. But God is good, and God had heard his prayer, and so God responds. We just need to go a couple slides. There we go. Then the Lord said to him, "No, Abraham, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abraham outside and said to him, he said, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you'll have." Right? That should make us look at how good God is going to be to Abraham. It looked like God had ignored him, had denied him, wasn't answering his prayer. And God was basically saying, just hold on, Abraham. I have a plan that's better than your plan. Abraham wanted, God, if I could just have one son to pass all my wealth to, I would be happy. And God's like, hold on, don't stop with one. I'm going to give you a multitude of descendants. God's plan for Abraham was better than Abraham could dream about, think about, wonder about, wish for. It was better. Genesis 15:6 says this about Abraham. "And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." Faith is so important to us receiving the good things that God has for us. God comes to Abraham and says, "I will give you a multitude of sons." And Abraham's old at this point. He has no sons. He goes, okay, I'll believe it. He doesn't believe for one. He believes for a multitude. He takes God and his word. He hasn't even seen one child. He hasn't even seen to begin for his life to move in that direction. He says, okay, God, if you said it, I'm going to believe it. That's what faith is. Faith is believing in the goodness of God when you don't see it yet. It's when you want something and you believe that God wants to give it to you and that God wouldn't hold out from you and God has maybe even promised that to you. And while you don't see it and you should give up on it and circumstances say that it'll never happen, faith says, I'll believe it. And I'll believe it before I see it. Faith is believing in the goodness of God when you don't see it yet. So time passes, and Abraham doesn't see the promise come to pass. And he begins to wonder, is God really going to be true to his promise? So he and his wife develop a plan. They have a plan, and his wife wants nothing more than to have a child either. So she comes up with a plan. She says, Abraham, go and sleep with my servant, and we'll have a child through my servant. And then we'll raise this son as if it's our own. Now, from our perspective, that is a terrible plan. I mean, that's nothing but trouble, which is exactly what happens. They do that. There's nothing but trouble. We're not going to get into that. But that's what we do when we're desperate. We make bad decisions. We want something so bad, we throw reason out the window. We don't take advice from wise counselors. We stop listening to God. We just want that thing so much. It pushes us into bad decisions. I've seen people make terrible relationship decisions. People make terrible financial decisions because they want it so bad. And God just isn't operating on their timetable. Like God isn't doing it as quickly. Abraham had an actual promise from God. And still he said, you know what, we'll make it happen. And they made a mess of their lives. We're not going to look at that in any more detail, but you can find it. What I want you to see is that we need to let the God of the promise bring the promise into being. Sometimes we have to wait on God. God's eternal, and so his concept of time is different than our concept of time. But if God said it, God will bring it to pass. So if you're waiting on something and trusting God for something, you need to be patient and let him do it in his time. Abraham has another conversation with God. He gets more details about God's plan. And here's what's so interesting. When God first spoke to him, he didn't give him any details. He just wanted Abraham to have hope that'll hold him over till it comes to pass. Now God gives him some more details in Genesis 17, verse 16, and it's about his wife Sarah. It says this, "And I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants." Again, look at how good God's plan is. So Abraham hears you're going to have a son, and then he tries to sort it out, and he makes a mess of it. Now God comes and gives him some details. He says, here's how it's going to work, Abraham. This is my plan for your life. It's that you'll have a son, but not just have a son. Your wife, Sarah, will be the mother of your son. And she won't just have a son, she will become the mother of many nations. Not just people, but absolutely like nations full of people. And not just the mother of nations, she'll be the mother of kings of nations. Look at how much greater God's plan for Abraham and Sarah was than Abraham and Sarah's plan was for them. God, would you just please give us one son? And God's like, where's your faith? I've got more than that for you. But they went ahead and they made a mess of it a little bit, but God is a redeeming God, and he begins to work anyway. We won't always know the details of God's plan. We have to learn to trust God with the details. But God, I wanted it yesterday. But God, I wanted a different color. But God, I wanted... And God's like, hold on. Am I good or am I not good? Trust God with the details. God's plan is bigger, and it's better than you can ask or imagine. This message is part of a year-long series we're doing that we're calling More. And this series is based on one verse from the book of Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 20, where it says this. It says, now all glory to God, who is able, through his mighty power at work within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think or dream or want or desire or plan. Infinitely more. God's plan for your life is infinitely more than your plan for your life. God's solution to your problem is infinitely more than your solution to your problem. We have to get to the point where we have faith to trust in the goodness of God when we don't see it yet. And know that God knows what's going on in our lives, and he'll look after us. Believe God for goodness when you don't see it happening yet. All right, well, let's look at the name changes for Abraham and Sarah. God has made this giant promise to them. The name Abram means high father. Can you imagine being called high father and having no kids? And wanting nothing more than a kid? Every time someone addresses you, you're reminded that the one thing that you want more than anything else is the one thing that you don't have. And so Abram lives with this for years and years and years. And then God makes him this promise that he'll be the father of as many stars are in the sky. And so he says, I'm going to change your name. No longer will people call you high father. They'll call you father of a multitude. Just this reminder, hey, Abraham, I made a promise to you. I'm doing something behind the scenes. You can trust me. It's coming. I'm a good father. Sarai, her name meant my princess. God changed her name to mother of nations. To remind her that it might for a while feel like I've abandoned you. Like I'm not hearing you when you pray. Nothing worse than delayed answers to prayer. Like when you want something and God seems to not be answering. God never turns a deaf ear to your prayer. Sometimes he just works slower than we'd like. Like the minute you pray something, or even before that, God's working on it. He just doesn't promise to sort it out the way we want or when we want. There's no such thing as an unanswered prayer. God will do exceedingly and abundantly more than you can ask or imagine or even pray. So what do you want? And will you trust God to take care of it in his time and in the perfect way that'll be even better than you could think of? Can't rush God's plan. Abraham doesn't find out these details from God until he's 99 years old. His wife Sarah is 90. So the one thing he wants, that ship has sailed. Like at 99 and 90, the chances of conceiving are 0. And that's how they felt. They felt hopeless. And with Abraham and Sarah, it was hopeless. Both with Abraham and Sarah and God, piece of cake. God's plans are better than our plans. But you can understand they might have a few questions. It says this in Genesis 17. Then Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. How could I become a father at the age of 100? Fair question. And how can Sarah have a baby when she's 90 years old? Fair question. So Abraham said to God, may Ishmael live under your special blessing. But God replied, no, Sarah, your wife, mother of nations, will give birth to a son for you. Ishmael is the son of Sarah's servant. And so Abraham hears what God says. God, that isn't possible. But I did a little something over here, and I've got a son. And could you just, all those blessings you're promising, can they just flow through Ishmael? God's like, that's not my plan. My plan is way better than that. Sometimes we want to sacrifice for like the B plan that we came up with. And God's like, there's something so much better. And so thankfully he said, nope, you're going to have to wait. And your wife, Sarah, mother of nations, she'll give birth to a son for you. Okay. Fast forward 20 years or so, and God has kept his promise. Abraham has a son named Isaac with his wife, Sarah. Isaac at this point is somewhere around 18 years old, which means Abraham and Sarah, they've now embraced that promise, and they're looking forward to the grandchildren that God promised, right? When will the kings of nations come? They've moved on. They've accepted this gift from God, and now they're looking for the rest of the plan to unfold. God says this to Abraham when Isaac is somewhere around 18 years old. As a young man, God says, take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. How do you respond to that? God promises him a son. It's the one thing he wants more than anything else. God comes through on the promise. You enjoy the promise for 18 years. You love this son so much. And then this good God says, go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on the mountain. How do you respond to that? Let's put it this way. What do you love so much? It might be the thing we started with that you want more than anything else. And if God came to you and said, I want you to sacrifice that to me, just build a great big bonfire and throw it in there, how do you respond to that? I have some questions and reservations and hesitation, but let's look at what Abraham does. Abraham had learned that even when life looked like it wasn't going well, that God was still good and he could trust him. The next morning, no delay, Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac. Then he chopped wood for a fire for a burnt offering and set out for the place that God had told him about. Abraham had learned to trust God, even when it looked like God wasn't being good. Let's keep going. Verse 4. On the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. What were those 3 days like? Right? Like God says go, and it's a 3-day journey where he's got to wrestle through the thoughts of what is going on. And the son that I love so much, I'm taking him on a journey to sacrifice him because the God who has proven himself so good to me over and over again has asked me to do that. What are those days like? This is not the life that Abraham had imagined. And sometimes that's what our life looks like. It's not what we had imagined. It's not what we would imagine a life lived in relationship with God should look like. Like when we're dealing with suffering or sickness or sadness, or we're not getting the thing that we want. That's not what it's supposed to look like, God. And now it looks like God is taking away the most important thing to him. And how does he handle that? When you're in those situations, there's one of 2 ways you can handle that. You can either say, but God, you promised. You asked this question, didn't you promise me, God? Aren't you good? Didn't you say I could have this good thing? Or you can say it as an emphatic statement, but God, you promised. And one is an expression of doubt. It's like, God, aren't you good? Didn't you say I could have this thing? Are you going back on your promise? Are you not being true to your word? Or are you the type of God who withholds good things from me? That's one response. Or you say it as a declaration of faith and say, but God, you promised. And no matter what my circumstances look like, I will walk 3 days from here to there with wood on the donkey. And I believe that I'll still be the father of nations. Because God, you're good. And you said it. And I won't always understand the details of your plan, but I've learned one thing. I can trust your plan. Because you're good. And you only have good for me. Abraham, over his 120 years, get this, he's 120 now. Like if Isaac's gone, that's probably it. But he'd learned to trust God, that even when he didn't understand the plan, that God could be trusted with the plan. And if God promised him a thing, the thing would come to pass. And God promised him specifically that the son, Isaac, of his wife Sarah, would become the father of a multitude. He just took God at his word. Let's look at how he responds. It says this in Genesis 22, verse 5. He says this to the servant, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will travel a little farther. We will worship there, and then we will come right back." How did he know that? Because God promised him. God said that your son Isaac will be the father of nations. Well, you can't be the father of nations if you're dead. And so he just took God at his word. He didn't know how this would all shape up, but he trusted God's promise and God's plan. So Abraham and Isaac, they travel a little further. Isaac is 18. He's not a dummy. He begins to ask questions. Hey, God, like we got the wood, we got the fire. Where's the sacrificial animal? Abraham says this in verse 8. God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son. He believed that God would come through. Like, I can't see it. I don't know where the animal is, but I know one thing. I can trust my God. The circumstances told him to believe the opposite. But his God said, your son Isaac will become the father of nations. Just trusted in God's goodness. His belief in God's goodness had to go beyond what he was able to see with his eyes. We all have to get there, where we believe for more good than we can see from our vantage point. That God's plan is infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. And there are days when we're going to need that kind of faith, when we don't see God's goodness yet. We move into the New Testament. We look back on the life of Abraham. It says this in Hebrews chapter 11, that it was by faith, the ability to look forward and see the goodness of God when we aren't seeing it yet. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. Get that unshakable belief in the goodness of God. Resurrections weren't a daily occurrence. That didn't happen a whole lot. It's not like he was seeing that happen all around him. But he knew that if God promised him that Isaac was the one, that if he actually had to go through it and sacrifice his son, God would bring him back from the dead so that his promise could be fulfilled. That's how good God is. We need to learn this, to let the God of the promise bring the promise into being. What is God promising you? What's the thing that you want? And this is hard, but a relationship of faith includes trusting God, the goodness of God's timing. God is on a different schedule. But he's got a plan for your life. And it's a good plan. And it's bigger and greater and more than you can imagine at this point. In this moment, you have this thing in your mind that you want so much. And maybe it's a big grand thing. It's like it's not a trivial little trinket that you're shopping for on eBay. It's something big that you want so much. And God's like, I heard you. I got it. And I'm going to blow your mind with what I'm going to do for you. Infinitely more than you can ask or imagine. But there will be seasons where we're delayed and that prayer seems to be going unanswered. So what do we do in those seasons? Number one is this: don't mistake a delay for a denial. Right? Just because you don't see it yet, that doesn't mean God has said no. It just means God is saying, I'm working on something really great. And it's going to take a little bit. But it's coming. Isaac is coming. Don't settle for Ishmael when Isaac, father of nations, father of kings, is coming. In the New Testament, we're told very clearly that when we follow Jesus, when we live a life where we allow God to lead our life, we're going to need patience. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience. It's going to take a little patience to follow God because God's plan isn't according to your timetable. He does it when he knows it's best. So we're going to need to develop patience. What can we do? We can keep on asking. God's not offended when we ask over and over and over. Keep on knocking. It says this in Matthew 7. Keep on asking and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, you will find. Keep on knocking and the door will be open for you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and to everyone who knocks, the door will be open. You don't ask once and then you don't see it and you assume that God said no. You keep going back over and over and over. And when you can't see the goodness of God in this area, you presume upon the goodness of God and say, God will come through. God will deliver. God will provide. God will heal. We always hope when God's part of the equation. So don't mistake a delay for a denial. The second one is don't mistake a detour for a denial. I mean, that trip to Moriah with Isaac, that was a massive detour that he could have interpreted as a denial. But it wasn't. It was all part of God's plan. Abraham came to see God as someone he could always trust. I mean, when I say always, I mean always. He's walking toward Moriah. He's got the wood and the fire and the son to sacrifice. And he's at that place, he's still saying, God will supply a lamb. He never counted God out. We need to learn that. Never count God out. He's 99, she's 90, and they're going to have a baby. He's 120, she's 110, and he's taken him to sacrifice him, and God will provide a lamb. He never counted God out. We need that kind of faith that sees the goodness of God even when we don't see it yet. Ephesians 3:20 again, it says this. Now all glory to God, who is able. What's going on in your life? God's able. If Abraham and Sarah can have a baby at 190, what are you facing that's too big for God? Nothing. Through his mighty power at work within us to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think. God has more. Well, in this series that we're calling More, in context, this verse says what we really need more of is more of God. And the more of God I get in my life, the more God's able to work in my life. And so the pursuit of more is actually the pursuit of God. And when we pursue God, that's when we find true and lasting satisfaction. But the Bible promises that we have this good God and we have a relationship with him. He provides for us. He meets our needs. Whole bunch of great promises. And in this series, to know God is to know him by his name. And in the Bible, God reveals himself by so many different names. In this experience, Abraham came to know God in a new way. And he came to know God by a new name. Genesis 22, verse 13 to 14, it says this. Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place Yahweh-Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. Abraham came to see God as that God always provides. The Lord will provide. God will provide. When it looks like there's no way for God to provide, God will provide. This name of God is future facing. This isn't looking back to the past. It's not looking at God in the present. It doesn't say that God did provide. It doesn't say that God does provide. It's future facing. It's that God will provide. He's learning that he can always trust God when it seems like all the resources are limited, they've been depleted, that there's nothing to hope for. God still will provide. It's seeing the goodness of God before you see it yet. God will provide. We need to come to know God as a God who will provide. That no matter what I face tomorrow, God will meet me there and God will provide. God will. What do you need? What do you want? Abraham didn't need a child. He could have lived his life without one, but he sure wanted one. And our good God gave him the thing he wanted more than anything else. God will. In Abraham's case, God will provide. What do you want? What are you praying for? What are you searching the internet for? That you're not seeing quite yet. Maybe faith is starting to erode and fade away. I want you to see the goodness of God even though you don't see it yet. You don't see the solution. It seems hopeless. There's no plan. The ship has sailed. You need to come to know God as God will provide. George Mueller was a German missionary to England. And George set up an orphanage. And this orphanage housed 300 children who had no home, no parents, nothing. And so he took them in and he loved them and he gave them a place and he provided for them. Well, George, he didn't like to communicate need. He just wanted to pray about it and trust God to provide, to see God's goodness even when he couldn't see it yet. And so he has these 300 kids, and the house mother comes to George one morning. She says, George, there's no food. There's nothing. The cupboards are bare. And George said to her, set the table. And so she went and she set the tables for 300 hungry children. She came back to George and said, George, the tables are set. There's still no food. He said, gather the children, get them dressed, and have them sit at the table. So she did. She ran around, all the kids, all 300, sitting in the dining hall around tables set to eat. She came back to George and said, the children are at the tables. There's still no food. So George went into the dining hall, and he stood before the kids, and he said, let's thank God for our breakfast. And so George and these 300 kids, they began to pray. And as they were praying, there was a knock at the door, and it was the town baker. And the baker said that he had woken up at 4:30 in the morning with one thought on his mind: make bread for Mueller. So he made 3 batches of bread, and he brought it to George. As they were loading the bread into the orphanage, the milkman passed by, and his cart broke down. And because by the time the wheel would be fixed, the milk will have spoiled, so they gave the 10 large jugs of milk to the orphanage, which was just enough for 300 children. God's always got a plan. God's talking to the baker. He's working on the milk cart for you. So what's going on in your life? Where does it seem that God isn't answering your prayer? You've prayed it, and you prayed it. You feel like you're 99 and still wanting a baby. You need to know that God's working behind the scenes, and he's got a plan that is so much bigger and so much better than you've even dared to dream for before. Let's all stand together. Keep on asking, Jesus said. Keep on knocking. Keep on seeking. I'm going to pray. As I pray, I want you just to lift up to God in your own heart. You just tell him again, ask again for the thing that you want deep down, the thing that you need. Maybe you're wanting a child. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's the healing of a broken relationship. Maybe it's a physical healing. Maybe you're having some financial struggle. Maybe it's this problem that's so big you don't know what to do. You don't need to know what to do. God's got a plan. We're going to lift these up to God. I don't know what they are. I just know I have my own and you have yours. So we're going to pray together. We're going to give our lives back to God and trust him with what's going on.